launching the recording. We're recording now, and
Okay.
I know you can totally give an interview in Spanish, but I thought it was more important for you to be comfortable in your own language than me, if that's okay with you.
Sure, that's fine, of course. Absolutely.
You still
Yeah.
in Ukraine?
No, no, no. I'm in New York at the moment. I've had some unpleasant medical stuff that's kind of got me has me housebound for another couple of months. It's nothing life threatening, but well, it was, but it's no longer. But I'm not mobile at the moment, so I'm doing it
All
all
right.
by Zoom. I'm teaching my classes by Zoom, and I'll get back there in the late summer, early fall, and then I'll
Okay.
stay for a while. But so right now, but no, right now I'm in my flat in New York.
Okay. Well, as long as it's no longer life threatening.
No, no, no. I made it through. It's all okay.
So
But
congratulations on the new book. It's fantastic. I
thank
loved
you.
it, and let's talk about that if it's okay with you.
Sure, absolutely.
So I guess I could start by asking you. You know, you spent decades writing about war and humanitarianism and memory, and now it's capitalism and woke ideology. So you know what made you feel this was the moment to write this book?
Well, I don't. It. I always think subjects choose you rather than you choosing subjects as a writer. And I had a Substack for a while. It's moribund at the moment, but I found myself about 4 years ago, I guess, writing these entries about identity politics and woke. And I haven't written about cultural issues in any serious way for 30 years. And I mean, I did a bit of that when I was young. And then when I was in my mid 30s, I got kind of hijacked by war and humanitarian. And I never really looked back. So I mean, once in a while I write a literary essay but it's not something I'm particularly, I don't even think I'm that gifted at it, frankly. But, uh, but the more I looked at this identity politics and looked at these culture wars, so called, I started writing about this, and then a small publisher in the UK said, "Well, we could turn it into a book," and we edited it down, and that was the thing. I thought that people were slightly missing the point about the culture wars in two ways. The first being that it seemed to me that despite the self image of most of the identitarian left, in fact, that this left was no left at all, having abandoned economics, that as a black Marxist put it, I think I quote him, that the real point of all of this identity politics was to diversify the ruling class. And of course, they all fantasize themselves as, they all have fantasies of themselves as anti capitalists and as undermining the system. But of course, I think, in fact, they're providing, or they have the, under the social democratic or progressive, in inverted commas, administrations, it's almost as if they provide far from being undermining capitalism, they provide it with a kind of moral warrant. Uh,
Right.
so that was one element that I thought people on both sides of the debate were somewhat missing. And I've been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, in the 80s, I wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine called Multicultural, which they called, but it's an accurate reflection of the piece, Multiculturalism, Capitalism's Silent Partner. And I also thought identity politics, I thought the same thing about multiculturalism, but I talk about this at some length in Desire and Fate, and that is uh, that you, on one level, identity politics, particularly in universities, is part of the commercialization of culture. I mean, we could talk about how it's kitsch, and I think there's a lot of ways in which, particularly Kundra's definition of kitsch, which was that kitsch was having an opinion that you felt better about yourself for having. But I mean, it occurs to me that, you know, that if you just look at identity politics as in terms of markets, well, it's business school 101. It's, you have different products for different people. You can establish yourself in all these niche markets, and you have that many more products to sell, whether it's LGBT, you know, history in inverted commas, whether it's, you know, fantasies about Cleopatra or whatever, being black, and whatever it is, it's more stuff to sell. And at the same time, our universities increasingly, certainly in the English-speaking world, but I think increasingly in other parts of the world, in Western Europe and certainly in the Southern Cone and in Mexico, are increasingly commercial ventures in which students are customers. And so, of course, you know, the old shopkeeper's adage, the customer is always right. So you, instead of having the universities representing something that isn't necessarily going to please the students, suddenly the university is, you know, a business that obviously it's going to, it has these products to sell. And if the products don't sell, or if students want other products, well, the university, like a big good business, will oblige. And I thought also that was being missed on the one hand. And on the other hand, on the other side, or the other element, it seems to me that people weren't taking in, and that I tried to talk about, which was the degree to which the culture wars are, to some extent, part of the kind of you know, the triumph of a kind of radical subjectivity in the world that increasingly, I mean, the best example is in English. The identitarian people often don't say truth; they say my truth, and that, of course, is an element, but also that in some ways, the woke or the identitarian left is a departure from previous norms. But in another way, it's actually a kind of one more expression of all kinds of self-help ideas. I mean, for example, I got quite obsessed with this notion of safety, and that people said they felt unsafe if somebody whose views they thought odious was, say, speaking on campus. And of course, they don't mean that the person will draw a pistol out of his briefcase and shoot them in the eye. They mean that they will be damaged psychologically by hearing this stuff that they believe reprehensible, and that they medicalize everything. And in this, it's, as they say, as American as apple pie, because the medicalization of the psyche is has been going on for long before woke or identitarianism. It's all these ideas that if you're in some ways psychically damaged, you're going to be physically damaged. I mean, to pick the most anti-woke person imaginable, writer imaginable, Norman Mailer. I mean, nobody would have, I mean, he would have been shot today. And yet, you know, when he stabbed his wife, good follower of Wilhelm Reich that he was, he said, I got a lot of cancer out this way. And this was in the early 1960s, long before any of this stuff was, and the wellness movement, which is, you know, is far bigger than identity politics. There said to be 30 or 40 million people in the US and Canada who are involved in this. This seems to me on one level very much a subset, if you will, of those ideas of the conflation of the subjective with the objective, the medicalization of psychological distress, the belief that literally it's harming you. Because on one level, you say to yourself, well, how can they be talking about violence? There's no if some conservative comes to a college campus, uh, a MAGA person or whatever, they don't think that there's going to be actual violence, but they say that hearing something they don't like is injurious to their physical health. And that, it seems to me, that maybe the capitalism connection is something that, while I think I have I hope a somewhat original take on it. Obviously, other people have been talking about this, but I think I'm not. I think this connection to deep tendencies in post-Protestant cultures like the U.S. and Canada and Australia, and these ideas are really deeply ingrained. There is even an element of small town America in back 100 years ago in small towns, and it was said, one of the things people would say was, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. And and in a sense, that's part of what's going on now. Of course, it's now moved from the post-Protestant world to, if you will, the post-Catholic world in Latin America and in continental Europe, in France, and above all in Spain, um, and Ireland, oddly enough. But that may have more to do with the English-speaking culture in Ireland no longer having any sort of independence from that, it being a kind of cultural dependency of the U.S. and the U.K. Um, I think that the popularity of these ideas has to do with the obsession with health that is now universal in bourgeois societies, developed societies, but also that America's cultural hegemony is actually stronger than perhaps some people think it is or would like it to be. I mean, if you read these sort of left-wing magazines, you're all hearing about how there's a new world is being born and it's all over for the American empire. But the influence of someone like Judith Butler, who, as far as I'm concerned, is, makes phrenology look rational, is part of this American cultural hegemony. I was in South Africa not so long ago, and everyone at the University of Cape Town was talking about Judith Butler, and the same is true in Spain and many other places. So it's almost as if a negative version of American exceptionalism is still hegemonic, even if the hegemony takes the form of all these people who view themselves as existential critics of the American empire. So, I mean, those seem to me the elements that I at least tried to, in a very notational, somewhat aphoristic form, to take on.
Okay, so you've just mentioned many of the subjects that you cover in your book, from capitalism and its relation to woke and high culture and education and the influence of Freudian psychoanalysis. So let's I'd like to dig a little deeper on the subject of the origins, the ideological origins of what we call a woke ideology. Apropos of woke, you write that it's a kind of lumpen Rousseauianism.
Yes.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, uh, it's about privileging feeling over anything that doesn't fit in with one's feelings. That Rousseau is it's the anti-rationalist position on a certain level, the position that glorifies feeling, instinct, etc. And Rousseau, that's why Rousseau stands apart in the French Enlightenment from everybody else who, on a certain level, are trying to make reason the center of things. I mean, even the ghastly Jacobins, they thought they were serving reason. I mean, in fact, they were obviously, as Mr. Talman taught us long ago, that they probably have more to do with modern totalitarianism than modern rationality. But that modern totalitarianism in the communist form, in the left form, not in the Nazi or fascist form, which is more Rousseauian, in fact, but in the Bolshevik and Stalinist and Maoist form, it's all about making a claim about rationality. And so I think, first of all, that woke is a departure from that. In that sense, it's probably closer to fascism than to communism, despite the fact that in people identify themselves as anti-capitalists, as socialists, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it's easy because they don't, just as Rousseau had no economic ideas, as opposed to, say, I don't know, the Girondins or the Jacobins for that matter. The woke people have absolutely abandoned any kind of economic question. It's all about identity. It's not about, so that you have now universities which have never been more integrated in racial and gender terms, but also never been more high bourgeois. So that I read something about Oxford University now. There have never been more, there's never been even in the time when aristocrats went there, it seems that it's a throwback to that. Everyone comes from the high bourgeoisie, whether they're black or brown or white. That doesn't change anything. So I think that, but I think that the way that works is by saying that one's feelings about what is going on, what's happening, about everything from works of art to disciplines, even in the sciences. You see this in the most grotesque way in STEM fields in the US, where physicists write about various physical phenomena as non-binary because they transform. So the idea is, and everything becomes a kind of metaphor. I mean, I think that woke is also it's about the triumph of feeling over reason, but it's also about the triumph of a kind of metaphoric understanding. The most obvious is violence. I mean, again, coming back to what I was trying to say a bit earlier, that once you say that psychic violence is the same thing as physical violence, or maybe even worse, well, then you're deep in metaphor, which is why probably people in war zones have very little time for this stuff. These are ideas that really, I think, flourish in societies where violence is not for the bourgeoisie. Violence is not a central fact in their lives. I mean, of course, there's more street crime in all our cities and societies than there used to be, but I mean, it's not like if you live in Sudan or you live in Ukraine or you live in Myanmar, metaphorized violence is really not very relevant to your experience. Whereas here, I mean, whether it's Buenos Aires or Rio or New York or Paris, it's the people who are most interested in these ideas are the people who have the most freedom to make everything into a metaphor. So I think that I also think, Rousseau is a romantic, and in some ways, this is a very romantic idea that somehow your feelings and your desires. I mean, I called the book Desire and Fate, and it actually, the quote, the line comes from a Marxist scientist, a British Marxist scientist who ended up in India in Nehru times, a guy called Desmond Bernal, J.D. Bernal. And he wrote a kind of philosophical essay. And he was a hardline, old fashioned, you know, Stalinist, I suppose you'd probably say today. Um, but he has a line where he says, there's the future of desire and the future of fate, and human reason has never learned to distinguish between them. Well, he could have been describing all of identity politics. I mean, one of the most interesting sidelines, I think I only have one entry about this in the book, but uh, is the degree to which a lot of these identity politics people write science fiction, a la, in the Fourierist sense, in the sense of, these utopian fantasies of the future. So, they'll write, there's even a form, it's particularly true in African American identity politics. They call it, it has various names. I'm blocking the one, but it's fantasy writing. I saw recently there's a particularly vile pro-Hamas poet and writer in the U.S. Of Palestinian origin, and she's just written a children's book. And if you look
What
on
do you make of
YouTube,
that?
well, I think it's part of the contempt for reality that the identitarians have. I mean, this book is, as she describes it, all I know is a little TikTok video of her description of the book that I saw. And it says, well, Palestine goes to the moon and saves the world. And so there are all this world of redemptive fantasy. I mentioned, I referred to, the severities of the great political historian J.L. Talmon, Israeli political historian, who wrote about precisely the whole tradition of antinomian politics dating back to the heresies of the Middle Ages. And he, the totalitarian systems that he describes are in large measure millenarian ones. We're the woke ideas. It's much more the end of history than Fukuyama, I think, by quite a long shot. And so I think that I think the identitarian political thing, even if it look like every idea, there's some truth to it. The canon of art is arbitrary. There's lots of stuff that got left out, and lots of stuff that was treated as sacrosanct that isn't nearly as good as people said it was, or that simply can't be read today. I mean, I frankly defy anyone to, an English-speaking reader to read Spencer or Dryden. It really, you have to be, I think most educated people would find it hard to really make their way through the Fairy Queen, let's say, of Spencer's, and so, and everything is mortal. I mean, it's not just we human beings, it's cultures and civilizations, and of course there's work that is no longer legible or available to us except as a form of piety. I mean, there's other work that is completely alive, like Homer. I mean, everyone goes on translating Homer passionately, arguing about it the whole time. And yet you could say, well, Homer's world is a lot further from ours than Dryden's. but but yet the power of that remains. I mean, there must have been 5 translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey in the last 7 years, or 4 anyway, of each, and in English. And I think that's not just in the English-speaking world that this is true. I, but you know, the the even though I'd concede that, I think that identitarian politics is a full-scale assault on all high culture, because it privileges representation over transcendence. And the whole point of art was supposedly some kind of transcendent form. It wasn't just meant to be autobiography of either oneself or of one's clan, using clan in the most in the widest possible sense of the word. And so, I mean, if you go to an American bookshop and you look at the fiction pile, it's all disguised autobiography, or it's various kinds of fantasy fiction of different kinds. The idea that you would, that you, it's also an idea that all work is political, which, again, there's a kernel of truth to that, in the sense that there is, you can locate any piece of work, even the most morally and aesthetically, more even aesthetically ambitious kind. Of course, you can connect it to the social world out of which it comes. I mean that, but I think the identitarian people take this obvious fact and make it central in a way that it isn't. I mean, yeah, you see it in museums now. Everybody, all these unspeakable museums. The UK is the worst of all, I think, where you get a painter like Turner and Constable, and they can't talk about them without the slave trade, the exclusionary category of the countryside, et cetera, et cetera. And so, if you go to a British museum, the National Gallery or the National Portrait Gallery or the British Museum itself, and you see a show, and you have any sense at all, you have to just ignore what's written on the walls, because it's all politicized stuff. So these great artists who, yeah, sure, is can you connect Turner to the rise of a certain kind of bourgeoisie in England in the first part of the 19th century? Of course you can, but it's the least interesting thing about Turner. In fact, the more socially relevant the work, the less likely it is to be good. It's the difference in French literature between, somebody like Balzac, who transcends his time, and these mediocre novelists of the same period who are completely trapped in their time.
Even though Balzac did consciously attempt to reflect the social realities of his time, but he transcended them.
He transcended them just as Dickens transcends them. Now, of course, and I think we all, I mean, unless we're social historians, but if we're for people who just love literature, when Balzac takes 40 pages to talk about the printing press, and I think it's Illusion Perdue. I'm not sure which of those are. It's maybe, it's one of those. My eyes actually sort of glaze over, as they do, frankly, reading Middlemarch, and George Eliot. Of course, it's brilliantly made, but I'm not sure it doesn't transcend, in my view. And so, that's why, to some extent, it's no longer true, because poetry now is so didactic. But, that's why, in some ways, poetry, Joseph Brodsky used to say, prose was the infantry, but poetry was the Air Force. And, you know, I think he
Good.
was right in he loved military metaphors, Brodsky. But, you know, the assault on culture it's in the name of justice and in the name of representation. But in fact, it's really it's a death knell for the arts. I mean, it's fascinating. For example, you go to the Metropolitan Opera in New York, which is pretty good. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not quite as good as it thinks it is, but it's pretty good. And you know, I think there are a few that are better in Paris and in London, particularly. But you know, they do all the opera classics, and then they do all this woke stuff that they've commissioned, which is all about identity politics. And again, you know, you can make great art out of you know, you can have conformity in the arts. Sinyavsky's great book pamphlet on socialist realism, um, you know, talks about the problem with. I mean, in effect, he says, he doesn't use the word, that the problem isn't that socialist realism is conformist. The problem is that it's basically kitsch, that it's phony. Um, the Again, he doesn't use the word kitsch, but it's entirely congruent, his view with Kundera's. And you know, look at look at all the great works of Christian art. It wasn't as if you were allowed to have another opinion. I mean, yeah, there are a few seditious
Artists.
paintings. Yeah, but I mean, for the most part, the people who made the stained glass windows in the Gothic cathedrals, you know, it wasn't as if they were open to other versions of truth. But what you have in I think in what they were not was subjective. They
Yeah.
they were trying to portray, you know, transcendence in the purest sense, which is faith. Um, and that's a whole other. It's all quite literal. It's not.
Mhm.
You know, they're not talking about themselves, which is why, of course, so many of them are still not known to us. But I think it's this question of this radical self.
Wait, wait. Give me, David. Hello.
Yes. Hello.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I lost you a few seconds ago. Now I hear you again.
Can you hear me
Could you
again?
please repeat?
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, what's different is this radical social subjectivity in the name of representation of the, you know, this idea that somehow to be marginalized or excluded is a moral quality, you know, and yet perhaps because I come to this from having been a kind of war correspondent for several decades, and even now, although I'm much too old to do the kind of frontline stuff, I spend a third of my life since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I teach in the university, and I go to all these quite difficult places. But in for a lot of reasons, but I find it quite extraordinary that the degree to which the subjective has triumphed in our view of art. It seems to me it's immiscible, frankly. Now, you know, and yet this subjectivity does go. But you mentioned Rousseau, and indeed, a lot of it goes back to Rousseau. There's a story in Hume in that Hume writes that Rousseau and Hume knew each other. And at some point, I think it was when Rousseau was in particular trouble with the authorities, uh, Hume invited him to Edinburgh, and it wasn't a success because Rousseau was obviously completely hysterical, not a word of Hume uses. And Hume tells the story of Rousseau. They're sitting in the front of the fire in Hume's house in Newtown, Edinburgh. And suddenly Rousseau blurts out, "But David Hume is not a bad man." And I and Hume then notes in his dry way, Rousseau was like a man walking around without his skin on. And I think um,
Well,
the
that's a
woke thing is that everything,
yeah.
this notion of the microaggression and all of this, everybody is waiting to be offended. And that I think is, and everyone is psychically unbelievably fragile. So that the idea that an opinion in a seminar room or in whatever can actually do you harm. I mean, you have to be awfully hypersensitive for that. And yet,
But
that's
at
the
the
test of the times.
but at the same time, the woke ideology seems to constantly weaponize the this fragility, this vulnerability to silence dissent, right?
Absolutely. But it's the ultimate passive aggressive ideology. I mean, if you want to put it in psychological terms, I mean, just as, you know, there's a certain kind of person, we've all had them in our lives, who weaponize their own fragility in relationships. And I
Sure.
think we've all known such people. Many of us have been married to them. And the uh, you know you use your fragility as a kind of club, and I think that's what the woke, the so-called snowflake behavior of woke people is. It's weaponizing victimhood, and of course, it's also making people out to be greater victims than they are, and also to moralize victimhood. I mean, it's astonishing to me to watch this rhetoric in which the victims are always good. And yet, if you have any historical sense at all, you know that being a victim, it establishes nothing about your moral character. Indeed, I mean, what I was in Rwanda in the bad days, and when the RPF, the Tutsis came back from Uganda and overthrew the genocidal government, and then started committing massacres of their own. If I
Well,
didn't know before,
You cite Franz Fanon
yeah,
as being
sure,
aware that the victims of today are they easily
exactly.
become the
The
aggressors of
victimizers, the
tomorrow.
aggressors of tomorrow. But it's absolutely true, and that's why the woke fondness for Fanon, I think, is I'm with Achille Mbembe and those people who say that Fanon is much less.
Hey, David, I'm I'm really sorry, but I have to change headphones. Something is. I'm sorry about the inconvenience. Give me just a second. I'm sorry. Uh, I don't know what. Hello? No, I still can't hear you. I don't know why. I'm just to get I'm going to get rid of the headphones altogether. I'm sorry. Um
if you want.
Okay, let's try it this way. I'm sorry. I can hear you now. Can you hear me? No, for some reason I can't hear you. I'm sorry. How about, let me see. It's never really happened to me before. Uh, um, I'm just, wait. Damn. Um, Look, I'm going to um I'm going to hang up and start the call again. I don't know what else to do. Can we do that? Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry.